Hello everyone, and welcome to another Blender Made Easy tutorial. Today I'm going to show you the process of how I use Blender to create this really nice Eclipse environment. From setting up the scene using a built-in add-on, creating a lake with a couple clicks, and then combining multiple render layers to turn what would be a boring looking render into something really nice. If you haven't been living under a rock, you'll know that the eclipse just happened about 2 days ago at the recording of this video, and here's a photo that I took. Yeah, my phone camera is not that great. That's why I decided to make my own using Blender. So jumping into Blender, what we'll do first is using the default cube, we're going to go over to the modifier tab, click add modifier, and this is going to be the ocean modifier, down here in the physics. This is what we'll use to create the lake. Over on the right side, we're going to change a couple of the settings to actually get it to look like a lake. Firstly, underneath the waves, we're going to set the scale of this down to 0.05. This will make sure that everything is pretty flat. The smallest wave, I'm going to go down to 0 so that any size of wave can be in our lake. And then the choppiness, we're going to go down to 0.5. For the spectrum down here, we don't want to use turbulent ocean, we want to use established ocean. This will make sure that everything is very flat. Now if you still can't see anything, that's because the resolution is very low. So let's set both the view and the render to about 44. This should give us a lot more detail in the lake, as you can see there. Go ahead and delete the default lamp, we're not going to need that either. And let's position our camera in the front right here. So press 1 on the number pad, then hit Ctrl Alt numpad 0 to snap the camera to place. Or you can come up to view, down to align view, and then select the align active camera to view. That does the exact same thing. From here, select your camera, G, move it up a little bit, and then zoom in. We're going to want to get our position of our camera first before we start adding in any of the landscapes, because we're not going to know where to position them if we don't have the camera set up. Over in the camera settings, I'm going to set the focal length a little bit lower so we get a wider lens, and then I'll zoom in a bit more, somewhere around here. At this point, we can add in those landscapes. Now we're going to use an add-on called the landscape add-on, and to enable that, go over to your user preferences. Underneath add-ons, you're going to want to search the word land, and you should see it right there. Make sure that is enabled. From here, we can press Shift A, and underneath the mesh setting, we're going to select landscape. Now currently this is way too small. Let's open up the menu down here, and there is a lot of settings that we can change in order to get this to look good. First, I'm going to change the operator preset from the default one over to default large. This will give us a much bigger terrain. Next, I want to expand this along the x-axis, so instead of being just like a square, it's actually kind of a ridge of mountains. We can do this by changing the mesh size down here. Not the size down here, because that's just basically going to stretch it out. We want to change the actual mesh size. So dragging this up, we can get what we're looking for. Something like that will look pretty good. We're going to set these subdivisions up here to 256 so we get more detail in the terrain. And with that done, we can go ahead and drag this backwards. We're going to place it somewhere around here. Now, I do want there to be multiple landscapes around. This will give us a much better sense of scale. So what we'll do is we'll just add in another landscape. When we do this, it's going to use the same preset that we just created with this one back here. But what we'll want to do is change the random seed value. This will give us a different option for the terrain. And I think that looks pretty good. Let's drag this one back and place it somewhere over there. We'll do this one more time. So we'll add in another landscape, change the random seed a little bit until we get something that we like. That looks pretty good. And then just drag it back somewhere around here. Jumping into the camera view, we're going to drag this one down, scale it up a little bit, place it somewhere on the left side. This one in the back, we'll scale this one up, place it over on the right side. And then this one right here, we'll scale this one up. And if you notice that you still can't see it, that's because the clip start and end values are really small for the camera. So go ahead and select the camera, and then in the camera properties, set the end frame to something way higher, like 10,000. And then you should be able to see that terrain in the background. Once you're happy with the position of your landscape, so let's add in the sun and the moon. And for this, we'll just use a UV sphere. We're going to press Ctrl 2 to add in a subdivision surface to smooth it out, and then you can also right click and shade it smooth. We'll drag this back and then make sure this is behind everything, and then we'll scale it up pretty large. We'll go into the camera view and make sure it looks good. So scale it up even more, and this is going to be the size of your moon. So scale it up to the exact size that you want. Somewhere around there should be pretty good. Next, what we'll do is we'll Shift D this, drag it behind the moon, go back into the camera view, and then position this one. This is going to be the sun that is around the outside of the moon. So scale it up and then position it where you want. Somewhere around there will be pretty good. Now, in order to see the ring a little bit better, we can select the sun, create a new material, and then underneath the viewport display, just change it to something else, maybe like a blue color, for example. And there we can see it a bit better, and we can position it how we want. I want this side to be very thin, and I want this side to be a little bit of a heavier ring. So somewhere around there will look really good. Next, we're going to Shift D the sun in the background. We're going to scale it down and then just move it a little bit over to the left right here. We're going to add a little bit of a bump, and this is going to be a really cool effect in the compositor once we add glow. This spot will look a lot brighter than everywhere else, and it's just going to add a cool effect. So somewhere like this will look pretty good. And there we go, we now have all of the objects in our scene. The next step is to separate them into multiple layers. This will come in handy later once we actually render the multiple layers. So first off, I'm going to select the moon. We're going to move it to its own collection. So press M, move it to a new collection, and this is going to be the moon collection. Then we're going to select the two spheres in the back, the small one and the big one. We're going to press M, move this to its own collection. We're going to call this sun. Then we can go ahead and collapse all of these objects. Those are the only collections that we're going to need. The first material that we'll do is we'll set up the lake first. We're going to select it, change the surface to a glossy shader, and then bring the roughness down to 0. And then for the color, we're just going to give it a blue grayish color, something like that. Let's go into the rendered view, and we're also going to be using cycles for this. So make sure to jump over to the scene panel and switch it from Eevee over to cycles. That's looking pretty good so far, but we don't have any lighting. So let's go ahead and add that in. We're going to jump over to the shading workspace. Underneath the bottom right here, we're going to switch it from object over to the world settings. So for the world settings, what we'll do is we'll just add in a sky texture. I'm going to press Shift A and go over to texture and then add in a sky texture. We'll place that right about here. Take the color and plug it into the background, and if we go into the rendered view now, we should be able to see what it looks like. Now, since we've already added our own sun, we don't need the sun disk right here, so go ahead and uncheck that. Next, we're going to bring the dust a little bit lower. Let's go with a value of 0.05, just a little bit of dust, and then for the strength of this, we're going to go down to 0.07. So we get a much darker look. That's looking pretty good. Now the reason why I'm not using an HDR is because I don't want there to be a sun in the scene. The sun I want is coming from this object that we've added. Next up, I want to add some fake clouds into our scene just to give the sky a little bit more interest. In order to do that, we're going to use a noise texture. We'll place that down here. To control this noise texture, we'll add in a color ramp. We'll take the factor, plug it in, and let's check what this looks like by selecting it. And if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, you can Control Shift and left click the color ramp. That plugs it into the world output so we can see exactly what this is doing. For the scale right here, we're going to go down to 2.5. The detail will go all the way up to 15. And then the roughness will drag it up just slightly to give us a bit more detail. Then in the color ramp, I'm going to drag this way. This should give us a little bit more contrast in the noise texture. Then to combine it with the sky texture, we're going to use a mix node. Underneath color, you can add in a mix node and place that there. You can take the color, plug it into the factor, and if we take a look at this, you should be able to see it in the scene. This bottom value now controls the color of that noise texture, and let's just drag it down so it's a little bit darker. Somewhere around there will look pretty good, and now we have some fake clouds in the scene. The next material is going to be the moon object right here. Go ahead and select it, change it from world over to object, and then give it a new material. We're just going to bring the base color all the way down to black and bring the roughness up to a value of 1. That's basically all we really need to do. For the sun behind the moon, go ahead and select one of the objects. And we already have a basic material right here, so let's just use this one. We're going to delete the principled shader and then add in a shader and emission shader. Take the emission, plug it into the surface, and set the strength all the way up to 100. For the color, we're going to give it a very orangish color, and if you want to use the same hex color code that I'm going to use, it's this one right here, FFDC8A. The next material is going to be the terrain objects right here, and for this we're going to be using a Polyhaven texture. The one that I found that looks pretty good is the Aerial Rocks 04, the link is in the description. You can go ahead and grab that, it's for free over on Polyhaven. You can change the resolution that you want, then just click download. If you have the Node Wrangler add-on, what we can do is with the principled shader selected, you can hit Ctrl, Shift, and T while hovering over it, and then you can navigate to where that texture is. Go ahead and select the diffuse, the normal map, and the roughness map. We don't really need the displacement. And then click Principled Shader Texture Setup. And it should automatically add all of those textures for you. Now you might notice though that the UV map does not look that great. It doesn't even have the texture applied. So what we'll do is just from camera view, we'll project this onto the texture. We can do this very easily by going into edit mode with everything selected, hit U and go project from view. And there we go, we can see the texture applied. Now one thing to keep in mind is up here, like where the parts are flat, the texture is going to be very stretched. But if you're looking from the camera view, you should not see any texture issues because we projected it from where the camera is looking. Go ahead and select all of the other objects just like this. And then from the camera view, you can go into edit mode, press A to select everything, go U, and project from view. Then to apply that material to all the other objects, select the object that we just added that material to, hit Ctrl or Command L, and then click on Link Materials. And now all of those should share that same material that we just added. For the scale of the texture, I think it's a little bit small, so over in the mapping node right here, let's just set all of these values to around 5. And that should look pretty good. And there we go, we've now added all of the materials and now we're ready to set up the render. So first off, let's create those multiple render layers. This one right here is going to be the main render layer, which is going to have every single object. For this view layer, we'll call this one main. Then we'll create a new render layer, we'll give it a new name right here, and for this one, it's going to be the moon. So go ahead, add the moon option and uncheck the sun and uncheck the main collection. So it's only displaying the moon collection. We'll do this one more time. We're going to add in a new view layer, new one right here. And this is going to be the environment. So just type in env for environment. We're going to uncheck both the moon and the sun from this view layer. Next, with this view layer selected, we're going to jump over to the environment scene panel right here. We're going to enable mist. We'll add that in the compositor later. And then also make sure environment is also checked. To control the mist pass, we need to jump over to the world settings right here and then open up this mist pass option. If we render this, the mist pass is going to be way too short. The start of it is going from 5 meters from the camera and ending at 25 meters, but our scene is way bigger than that. To figure out the scale of our scene, just exit out of the camera, and with the camera selected, you can hit G and then Y and move it all the way to the end of the scene. If you look in the top left, you'll see how many meters you've moved the camera, and we can see it's about 200 meters. So go ahead and then right click to cancel that action. And for the depth, let's set this all the way up to around 200. Next, we're going to jump over to the scene panel right here. Underneath the render tab, you can set the max samples that you want. 100 should be perfectly fine. You don't really need to go any higher than that. Underneath film, we're going to turn on transparency so the background disappears, but don't worry, we'll add that back in once we render everything out. And then for the color management, I'm going to set the look to high contrast. All right, there we go. Let's go ahead and render this out. So jump over to the render option here and click on render image. All right, the render has finished. And if you want to check out the individual render layers that we've rendered, you can select them right here. We can check out the moon one, environment, or the main that we've added. With that done, go ahead and exit out of there and jump over to the compositing workspace up at the top. We're going to click on use nodes, then press N to close off that panel, and then also close off this panel. We're going to need a lot of space here, so separate the render layers like that. And to check out what this looks like, let's hit Control, Shift, and left click on that render layers and that's going to add in a viewer node. We'll place that over here. And one trick that I like to do is I like to hold shift and then right click to add in a connection point here. So anything that we've added will automatically be updated into the viewer node. So over on the right side, the first thing that we'll need to do is press Shift D on this render layer and switch it from the main over to the environment. For this render layers, we're not going to use the image. What we will use is what we added, and that is the mist pass and the environment pass. To take a look at these, you can hold Control Shift and then left click a couple times. This is what the mist layer looks like, and then the environment looks like this. To add the environment back to this main layer, what we'll do is we'll press Shift A and go over to Color. Underneath Mix, we're going to add in a mixed color. We'll place that here. We'll take the image from the main layer, plug it into the bottom input, and then the environment is going to go into the top input. And then if we take the alpha, which this is what it looks like, the entire environment is white and then the background is black. This can be what we use to control where the environment appears. Let's press Shift A, and underneath Utilities, we'll add in a math node. We'll place that here from the alpha. We'll leave it on add, and then we're going to take the value, and this is going to be the factor. Let's take a look at this, and once we do that, we can see it's added the environment to our scene. Now there's one thing to note is that this has been added over top of our moon right here, which is actually what I want. This gives the cool effect that the sky is actually in front of the eclipse, which actually happens in real life. And you can control this using this value node right here. The lower you go here, the entire environment will appear. And then if you drag this up a little bit, it'll become darker, and then the background will appear, which gives us the eclipse back. And it also has that benefit of darkening the sky, because the higher you go, the more dark it becomes until it becomes black, which I actually think is pretty nice. So probably a value of about 0.5 will look pretty good. Next up, let's add the mist into the scene, and we can do this by just Shift D'ing this mix node. We'll place that right there. We're going to take the mist pass and plug that into a color ramp, and then the color ramp is going to go into the mix node. So let's press Shift A, and then underneath color, you can select the color ramp node. We'll place that there. Take the mist, plug it into the factor, and if we Control Shift left click on this, we can see what it looks like. With the color ramp, you can control where this is positioned on your mountains. I think actually this is pretty good. If you want to have less of an effect, you can darken this value. So somewhere around there might look pretty good. Then from here, take the image and plug that into the factor. Change the mode from mix over to screen, so it gets rid of all of the black values but keeps the white values. And now if we take a look at this, here is the effect that we get. Down here, this color controls the mist pass now. So if I set this to whatever color that I want, you can see it changes to that effect. And what I like to do is actually see what this looks like. We can see here we have a thin layer of like a yellowish color. So what I'll do is I'll take this color here using the eyedropper tool. We'll just select right where it transitioned from the mountain to the sky. Now if we take a look at this, it should blend a little bit better. But of course, if you want to have more of a blue mist pass, you can do that by adding it like this, or an orange mist pass. Kind of do whatever you want, but I found that this looks pretty good. Now for the fun part, let's actually add a really nice glow to the eclipse. We'll do this using a filter and then a glare node. We'll place that there. Change it from streaks over to fog glow. And then for the size, we'll drag that up to 9. And that's basically all we really need to do. Next, I'm going to add in another glare on top of that. We're going to press Shift D, place this one here. This time we're going to use the streaks option. Now this is way too strong, so what we'll do is we'll bring the color mix up to 0.5. The iterations will go up to 4. And then the mix value will go in the negative direction, which will lighten up that effect. Let's go with negative 0.2. And then for the fade option here, we're going to go down. This will make it sort of disappear. We'll go down to 0.84. And if you still think it's a little bit much, you can go even higher with the mix to a negative value. Maybe this can go down to 0.8. Now this is looking pretty good so far, but the color is not that great. I want everything to have a very reddish orangish hue, and also I want to darken everything up. We can add in a color, adjust, and then add in a color balance node. We'll place that right here. There are 3 values here. The lift is for the shadows, the gamma is for the midtones, and the gain is for the highlights. So for the highlights, which includes the eclipse, I want this to be a very reddish color. So I'm going to drag this all the way down to right about there. For the midtones, I also want this to be a reddish color, so we can drag that here. And then for the shadows, which is like the background right here, kind of in the water also, this I'm going to bring much more into the blue section. And there we go. We now have a much more high contrast image. And you can play around with the positions of these colors until you get something that you like. You can also change the values here, like for the shadows, I might darken the shadows a little bit. For the midtones, I might drag it up, and for the highlights, I might drag this down just a little bit, somewhere around here. You might notice a very big problem with our current render, and that is the black spot on the eclipse is no longer there. Now the reason for that is because we've mixed it, we've added the environment over top of the moon, and it's just started to kind of disappear. Now in order to bring that black spot back, we can select one of the render layers, Shift D it, and move it over here. And this, we're going to change it from the main over to the moon environment. Now, if you remember, the moon environment only has the moon and nothing else. So with this render layer, we can plug it back in and darken up that spot. Now, in order to get this to mix, we're going to need a color mix and then a mix color here. Change it from mix over to multiply. And then we can take the image and plug it into the image right here. Now you might notice this happens, but that's because we need to take the alpha and plug that into the factor. And once we do that, it's now gone, and now we have a black spot for the eclipse. To control this a bit better, we're going to go over to Utilities, add in a Math node, place it here from the alpha and the factor, and switch this over to Multiply, and now this bottom value controls how much of an effect that is. So I think a value of about 0.6 will be pretty good. That gives us a nice black spot there, maybe even a 0.7. And the last two things that we can add is a transform a lens distortion. We'll place that there. And for the dispersion, I like to go up just a little bit. Let's go with a value of 0.04 or so. And this is going to kind of blur out the corners, as you can see. And I think that gives it a cool effect. And the last thing we'll do is create a vignette around the corners so that the focus is on the eclipse itself. We'll Shift D the lens distortion, change the dispersion to 0, and the distort to 1. Then we're also going to need a filter, blur, and then just a blur node. We'll take the image, plug it in, change it from Gaussian over to fast Gaussian. And if we take a look at this, here's the result that we're getting. We can change it from relative, select Y, and change both of these values to 20%. So now we get a blurred effect there. Then you might know exactly what to do next. We're going to press Shift D, add this multiply node over here, take the image and plug it into the bottom input, and then just plug it into the viewer node. This factor value now controls how much of an effect this has. We can bring this down to around 0.6 or so, and there we go. If you think the streaks look a little bit weird, you could change it from medium over to high quality, and maybe that will help with the pixelation effect, which actually I think that did. So again, here is what the render looked like before any of the compositing. You can see it's very, very boring, but once we've added the environment, the glare, the color correction, lens distortion, all of that, here is the end result. But there we go, guys. That is how you create an eclipse environment render in Blender. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed, make sure to leave a comment down below, and if you created something from this tutorial, send it to me on Instagram at BlenderMadeEasy. But that'll do it. If you have suggestions for other tutorials as well, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next one.